Welcome to our Indie-stry chat. The members of Bloodhound Pix and an occasional guest give their no BS experiences with current aspects of the industry. Hi, and thank you for listening to this episode of Indie-stry, where I talk to a personal podcasting and horror journalist hero, Andrea Subissati, who is the editor of Rue Morgue and also the co-host of Faculty of Horror. Two things that I have brought up constantly within this podcast, within our own writing, and within my own personal writing. It was a real pleasure to talk to Andrea for the first time outside of email exchange, and it went wonderful. And she talked a lot about publication and where it might go and just the process, and also giving advice for people that may be interested in the future and how do you pitch and things like that. So listen up, because it's a really educational episode. I hope we get to have her back on because it was amazing. So hope you enjoy. Andrea, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to start off with, if you wanted to tell our listeners about your history and kind of how you came into horror.
Okay, so a quick question, a quick and easy one to start.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an easy question, if not a quick one. My entry point into horror, I think, for most people was through books, really. Like, I guess when I was a young adult, I was kind of devouring R.L. Stine. Like, Goosebumps wasn't around yet, but he had that Fear Street series. Do you remember Fear Street?
Oh,
I think they're making a movie about it. I think they're working on that.
Yeah, I know it's Hulu or Netflix. I think it's Netflix.
Oh, is it a series, not a movie?
Or it's movies, but I think it's broken, or it's 3 movies that will be released each month or something like that.
Okay. One of those.
Yeah.
It's not so clear-cut anymore what's a movie and what's a miniseries. Yeah. But anyway, from there, it went to Stephen King and then into Stephen King movies. And so that was my entry point to the entire horror genre. That's kind of how I became a fan. How I became interested in it intellectually, I guess, came much later. I was doing my master's in sociology in Ottawa, and my plan at the time was to write about knitting. I was interested in how the third wave of feminism was kind of reclaiming the domestic arts, and there was this big wave of knitting. Knitting was not only cool again, but it was punk rock and it was resistance, and I thought that was so interesting. And then Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead remake came out, and around the same time, 28 Days Later. And so I became aware that zombie movies were having something of a renaissance, something of a third wave of their own. Or I guess, maybe the second wave, maybe the third wave. The first doesn't really. Anyway, That's a whole different conversation. But I wrote my master's thesis on zombie movies. And, from there, I had a book launch party where I met the fine folks at Rue Morgue. Through networking in Toronto, I met Alexandra West, and we started the podcast. And just as I met the horror community here in Toronto, everybody was interested in doing really cool things. And I eventually became spoiled for choice for horror activities in the city.
Great. And so, you did kind of mention the podcast, which is Faculty of Horror. And I guess I'll kind of go off on a little tangent that, when I was kind of first getting into podcasting, listening to podcasts, I was trying to find something that was more academic, and because, just reading about the news or what the new movie coming out was never kind of interesting to me in that sense. So I remember stumbling upon Faculty of Horror, and it became this, it's one of those podcasts that I do, listen to consistently, where it's not just a single episode or whatever, it's every single one. And about that, which is kind of a compliment to you, I remember this, and I think we'll get into it in a little bit, about kind of male podcasters versus women podcasters, where it's this, I remember there was this knowledge that you had and this fierce owning it, but then also you were willing to show in the most, complimentary way this vulnerability, where I remember you talking about you relating to the subject and stuff like that, and I was just able to really connect as a listener, where it felt, for myself at least.
Oh, thank you. That's awesome. That's great to hear. It's funny, Alex and I were talking about that recently. We just recorded some bonus content for our Patreon last week, and our Patreon is only about a year old, but we've been making the show for, I think it's going on 8 years. I think it's going to be 8 years in December 2020, which is astonishing. And she reminded me that early in the podcast history, we were actually reluctant to use the word feminist. We were reluctant to call ourselves a feminist podcast, which now 8 years later is just, hysterical. I think that's something that's very special about the podcast, and definitely something that resonated with people. Not everyone, mind you. Yeah. And when we launched the podcast, I think we were also both new to the horror world, and feminism was kind of a loaded word. It wasn't accepted quite as warmly as it is now. But yeah, it's just funny that was part of our journey, whether or not to use the F word.
Yeah. It brings up a great question kind of about getting into the horror industry, because it is one of those things where I've mentioned it a couple times, like comic books, there was this mentality where, horror is only for basically young white men, and that was it. That's how they marketed it. That's how whatever. And what we're finding more and more now is that that's not the case at all, and it never was. So I'd love to hear kind of what it was like getting started, and even to modern day, which I assume we're going to get into all the events of 2020 and how that shaped horror too, but at least when you were kind of starting out.
Well, starting out, I think I was a guest on the Rue Morgue podcast, and they had me on as a guest because I had turned my master's thesis into a book, and so I was on to talk about that. And then Alex West was a guest a little later. I think we might have been a guest together at some point. So there were definitely opportunities afforded to me, and often my first appearance was about my book, as I just said, but that was also around the same time that Women in Horror Month became a thing, and I returned to the Rue Morgue podcast as a guest, to talk about rape revenge and to talk about kind of like feminism in horror. And I think for a lot of women involved in horror journalism and, horror inquiry, that's kind of the entry point is you become the token female to talk about the feminized topics within the genre, which is a little bit, it's a little bit narrow. And, I think that's something that at the time I was so grateful to even be invited that I wasn't very critical of it. But, after a while, it's just kind of like, I'd like to be invited to moderate panels that aren't just women in horror panels. I'd like to speak on topics that don't always pertain to rape or nudity or feminism or stuff like that. But that has happened, and it definitely took a couple of years of building your brand and showing that you've got the chops to talk across the board. And that's the thing with sexism, is that it's systematic and it's insidious, and nobody has ever said to my face, you can't do this because you're a woman, but you get told that in various other ways. You see who's getting gigs that you're maybe more qualified for, who's being invited to talk on subjects that you're not, that comes through in other ways.
And so kind of moving into, I don't know how much you're wanting to talk about this, but moving into 2020, we had, which we're still dealing with, we have COVID, there's the Black Lives Matter movement kind of really got a boost where it became more predominant. And then there was kind of certain aspects within the horror community where, without, I guess, giving names or company names or whatever, where, people were starting to be outed as kind of like this, as part of the Me Too movement as well. And where you could really see the horror community, I think, banding together and saying, well, enough is enough.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. I think partially it had to do with, just Me Too, Time's Up. It was definitely a movement that you don't have to stay silent about things that are oppressing you. And indeed, we have many more avenues to do so. If you want to do it directly or indirectly, you can do it anonymously. Like, all those avenues have opened up. recently. But also, I think as a result of the lockdown, a lot of people are locked down. They're isolated, they're scared, tempers are thin, and I think part of it is feeling like you've got nothing to lose, and so that has emboldened people to come forward. I think also, particularly when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement, it's if we are on the precipice of tearing down the old and building the new and putting new policies in place to protect people, then now is the time to air our grievances, because then you can be part of the reformation as much as you can be part of tearing everything down. So yeah, I think 2020 was kind of a perfect storm of factors to facilitate that big reckoning. It was a long time coming. A lot of the things that came up had been bubbling under the surface for a long time. And it was stuff that I had observed and maybe didn't feel super comfortable talking about because of my position. You don't want to look like you're, throwing shade on a competing publication. But the fact of the matter is, credit to everyone involved. Everything was handled appropriately. As far as I can tell with that particular issue, Black Lives Matter is going to be an ongoing commitment for us all against racism, and I hope it continues to go well.
So, kind of getting into that, how has that been moving forward with publication? I know there's been the push too, where you switch to the issues online, which has been a thing for a while now, but especially in kind of this era, I guess, producing a horror magazine and like moving forward as a horror community, as we've kind of talked about.
Yeah, I think we're hanging in there. I'm lucky to be in a situation where I can continue to work from home. As it is, I live in the Rue Morgue manor, so HQ is right here, and that's fine. And we've always been a small staff. So my part-timer wasn't coming in for a while toward the beginning of the pandemic, but she's coming in now to help out with mail out. But our art director works remotely. Our managing editor works remotely. Everyone else is working from home. So we're all very lucky that we are able to keep making the magazine during these uncertain times. The trickiest thing in the beginning of all this was stores closed meant that distribution shut down, which meant that way less of our magazine were being purchased. And so we simply couldn't print as many. And of course, that was coming upon, I think that was the issue that I put Nia DaCosta's Candyman on the cover. I was so excited to have Candyman. We're so excited about this movie, so excited to have that cover story. And then just, this all happens. So I'm grateful that we were able to still print it. We still have some in stock. They weren't on newsstands. And, I hear from Rue Morgue fans all the time that part of their Rue Morgue ritual is to go to the newsstand and pick up the new issue and to find it and take it home. And so it saddens me that people were deprived of that experience, but we're lucky to still be going at all. And as for the future, I think times are tough across the board. I'm not sure what it'll be if Rue Morgue is going to be able to get all of the grants from the government that we got in the past, the Canadian government, seeing as Canada has to focus on keeping its citizens afloat and alive. And our readership too. I think it's going to be tough times, and hopefully we'll hang in there.
I hope so too, and I think it's a great magazine that's always had a lot of in-depth conversation, and that is kind of one thing that I've always appreciated about it too, because there is this sense of where you also focus on the independent, and you focus on the obscure, and really going deep dives in those as well, instead of just, and I know on your podcast you've talked a little bit about Blumhouse, but, instead of focusing just on whatever they're coming out with, or whatever, the big tentpole, I guess you want to say, horror movie is.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky to find that balance because, first of all, being bi-monthly. So, for example, now, I don't know when you're planning on putting out this episode, but right now it's toward the end of August. I am already working on the November-December 2020 issue. So all of the press releases I'm getting right now of, hey, we just put out a new album yesterday, or this movie is coming out next week, or in 2 weeks or in early September. Like, I can't do very much with that because by the time we get to November, December, it's going to be old news. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that with regard to covering indie stuff or things that are on the festival circuit, I prefer to run coverage of stuff that my readers can easily find. Yeah. So as much as I would like to, support indie film, if they don't have wide distribution, then I'm just kind of telling my readers about something that they're not going to be able to look up for themselves, and that's a bummer. So I think the most challenging part of my job is kind of towing the line between those two tensions, that I am giving the coverage that readers expect at the quality that Rue Morgue has always offered, while still, helping out the little guy.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's kind of where I wanted to move on to, discussing the future, like based on everything that we've talked about and this year. I know from the film portion of it where people have talked about, well, from here on out, theaters will basically be primarily for tentpole movies or the major blockbuster or event films, and everything else will go to online, and they'll do things like what The Invisible Man did, or things like that, where you can buy a ticket for $19 and you have it for 48 hours or stuff like that. What do you see, I guess, for the moving forward, and have we kind of hit a point of no return, especially for horror publication and horror?
Well, I think movies are big business. Big business. Big money-making business. Movie journalism is not. You know what I mean? So insofar as I've got my fingers in that big business, and, I work with the PR and I work with the professionals, I feel like we come to horror from very, very different places. I understand that these big studios want to make their money back on the big releases that they had planned for this summer. And so I could understand why they would want to save it for theatrical. But I think The Invisible Man is a great example of how well a film can do, just dumped straight out on VOD. I think Rob Savage's The Host is a great example of, fans are thirsty. We're bored. We're stuck at home. We need something to watch. I'm not raring to go back into theaters. I am much more inclined to celebrate something that I can see from the comfort and safety of my own home. And, if I were the one behind the movie, I'd be like, I'd rather people see it and celebrate it than necessarily make all my money back. But that's me. And that's why I'm poor. Yeah. Just kidding.
No, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. And, I agree completely. I think that there is kind of this mentality that it also, in some weird way, has been providing more opportunity for the independent person or the independent filmmaker, where I've definitely feel like I've seen more independent or more smaller movies come out in 2020 that have been amazing that I might not have gotten to previously.
Well, yeah, and furthermore, as the new normal comes in, I think movies are going to start to look pretty dated pretty soon. I think eventually we're going to need to see some media with masks and social distancing, or I think that was the first thing I thought of when I heard that Halloween Kills is being pushed back an entire calendar year. Like, this time next year, our world is going to be so different. Is that movie still going to make sense?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And it's even the how they're filmed. I think what somebody was saying, I was talking to before, and they were kind of mentioning how even the whole process of, you have Jurassic Park or Jurassic World, Jurassic World, I guess, is, this huge movie with all of these casts and crew and extras, and, how can you really do that versus, will things start moving towards these skeleton crews and, having a small cast or something where you don't need 50 people on set and you don't need that type of size.
Yeah, a lot of change coming.
So, kind of, how do you think the genre will go in terms of the type of stories that it's telling? Where I know with Rue Morgue you released the Plague the plague issue, and then with Faculty of Horror, you did a summer of, talking about viruses and talking about plagues, and those are the types of movies that you've been looking into. So what do you think is going to be the next big wave?
Well, that's tricky to say. History has shown us that when things tend to get really bad, terrifying horror movies come out, but the mainstream takes a little bit less interest. People are kind of like, like after such a terrible time, people don't want to be scared. It's not always true. It's not often the case. But I think that is kind of a perspective from the executive level. So I think indie films are going to have a good time. I think, again, going back to Rob Savage's film, he was able to tap a nerve right when it was happening, on a very low budget, very creative, and, that film is doing really, really well. I think something that has come out in the Rue Morgue pandemic issue and in our plague discussions on the Faculty of Horror, that whatever the threat, be it aliens, be it disease, be it zombies, we need to see humanity coming together. And I think 2020 has been a very sobering year in terms of not being able to see eye to eye with our fellow human being on something as fundamental as Black Lives Matter, on something as fundamental as, the need for testing. I think that's going to be a hard pill to swallow, and I think there are many, many ways that is going to manifest in our horror coming up. And I can't wait. Bad times make for good horror movies.
Yeah. No, I'm excited to see what happens, and I think I have hope for it, I guess, in whatever way we can. I know I've heard a lot where it's, people have said where, it's going to get, the invasion of the body snatchers, or it's going to go back to the paranoia kind of horror, I guess, that we saw in, that pops up every couple of decades.
Yeah, could be.
So I was curious, I guess, talking about going a little bit more into, we're backtracking, but Faculty of Horror and kind of how that fully came about, what led to it. And I've mentioned it a little bit, and it's one of those, and I kind of gave you praise, and it's one of those podcasts that even if I'm writing a review, or even on this podcast itself, I talked about Ravenous, and it was one of those where I had only a couple minutes to really talk about it, so I said, deferred it to your episode on it, of saying, if you want to know more about it, just listen to Faculty of Horror, because it kind of describes a lot more than I am able to do, and probably a lot more articulate than I am able to do. So how did really that come about, and I guess your goal with that and your mission?
The Faculty of Horror came about from, I had been a guest on the Rue Morgue podcast, as I mentioned, which was my first exposure to podcasting. I don't even know that I really knew what it was at the time. Rue Morgue also had a bi-weekly radio show. They were calling it Rue Morgue Radio, and they had a couple of segments. They would play music. They had a host. I think it was differentiated slightly from the podcast in that it didn't have an RSS feed or something. Like, this was early enough in the technology that, like, it pretty much was a podcast, but we didn't call it that yet. Okay. But all this to say that Rue Morgue was kind of on the vanguard of this kind of technology. And so I became exposed to it by being on a podcast before I had ever really listened to many podcasts. And then Alex was also a guest on it. And then I met Alex and we hit it off. And she said, why don't we start a podcast? And for me, having seen firsthand that all it took was a couple of people talking in a room, I was friends with the guy who put together the Rue Morgue podcast, so I was confident that I could ask them for any help that I might need. And then for Alex's part, she was a bit more cognizant of what podcasts were out there. She was a bit more plugged into that world. And, so she was the one who said, there is probably a market for a podcast of two female lapsed academics talking about horror movies from a very personal and high-level point of view. There wasn't anything like that out there at the time, so we thought we'd give it a try. And then as the podcast went on, again, she became more well-read with the podcasting community. And I think as we gained traction, we decided to lean into the feminism because it was working for us. And it didn't always. In the beginning, there were definitely many criticisms that, I just want to hear talking about horror. I don't know why you're talking about politics. I don't know why you're talking about your personal experiences and stuff. And it took a little while before we really found our audience. But once we did, they shared it among like-minded people. And I don't know if you've had this experience with your podcast where it's like drops in the bucket of listeners. I think the first year, our listenership was very low. And then one Halloween, the AV Club or somebody spotlights us, and then things start to snowball from there. And that's something that I've heard from, YouTubers, influencers, content creators. Usually it takes just kind of one break, and then they kind of snowball, and things get bigger and better. And so, over the years, we received positive criticism and negative criticism, but we stayed true to ourselves because we had demonstrated that, being ourselves was resonating with enough people to keep going. And then it was about a year ago now-ish, I guess it was last September, that we launched the Patreon, which was something that, our mandate was always to offer our, academic level observations, but for free, and to really bring it down to earth and explain these concepts fully. And the podcast is still free, but now we're in a position where we can offer additional content to our super fans and make a couple of bucks that we just put back toward the show, getting better graphics, getting better t-shirt artists, getting better equipment, and all that good stuff. It's been really cool.
Oh, yeah. And I've been kind of happy to be one of the people that's been along for the ride. But I guess kind of the quick question is that, I didn't know that politics are supposed to be in horror. Isn't it just supposed to be for entertainment?
Oh, boy.
No, that's kind of interesting that you dealt with it. And it is one of those topics that we've talked about a lot. And even for this podcast, it has been kind of in a similar vein of that. It's like we just get a couple listeners here and there, and then when I started doing these interviews, or we would have one, because the rest of the podcast we would focus on independent and obscure horror, and there'd be one that somehow just struck a nerve with people, or somehow had a Sweet Home, where then immediately after we published our episode, I think Fangoria did a spotlight on it, and so it kind of helped, weirdly enough. But that actually gets into kind of the idea, and I know you've talked about it on the podcast, and some of the issues and the struggle with being on social media, and kind of especially moving forward with this industry of almost having to be on it consistently. I mean, I see a lot of people where it's, if they're in Eastern time zone, it seems like at 3 a.m. they're posting when I'm doing some work, but then I see something posted from 8 a.m. or some crazy thing like that.
Oh yeah, like from a business standpoint, it's you can't afford to ignore it. And I think when I first started at Rue Morgue as copy editor, like Rue Morgue didn't have a Twitter, and I was like, guys, we really need to get on Twitter. And so they were like, okay, you could do it. And I was like, oh God. And I remember being kind of intimidated to, represent such an institution to the world on social media. And I think that's something that every business kind of has to go through, is that you need to have your corporate voice, and then you also need to kind of share that personality. Rue Morgue, I come up against that for Faculty of Horror, obviously, because being a digital show that lives on the internet, we have to have a very strong internet presence. And then also just even for myself, I consider myself a brand, and I have certain roles and responsibilities that pertain to these institutions, but I also have my personal outlets where I can give my personal thoughts. And I take all that really seriously because I think people who listen to the show and read the magazine, I don't want them to see me as too distant and too remote. I want to be available to interact with the community, and I think that's the best way to do it.
And I think that's great, and it's kind of always been especially when I pitched. I've pitched several ideas to you, and I had the pleasure of writing a couple. And I remember it being this crazy element for me, at least, pitching of like just assuming, oh, I'm going to send out this email and then, not receive anything back, like usual or whatever. And because I'd only done like little things here and there, and I remember, you messaging back and like making it very personable, and it meant, it had meaning to it. There was, somebody behind the.
I'm glad to hear that, Craig. I truly wish I could get back to absolutely everybody who pitches for the magazine, but I think maybe if I had a bigger staff, such that I didn't have to take care of so many other operations within the magazine, so part of it is a time crunch and like just a tremendous volume of correspondence, but also a lot of the time people pitch something and it'll be good, like a good pitch, just why now? And, sometimes a pitch that seems irrelevant a month ago will become super relevant in the next month, or a pitch that doesn't really have a tie-in to anything especially relevant happening at the moment could make a good sidebar to another story that is relevant to what's happening at the moment. So I read every email that comes in. I save every pitch that comes in. And I think, sometimes people are like, can I get a yes? Can I get a no? It's like, well, if the answer isn't yes, it's usually maybe.
Yeah.
Unless it's no, in which case I'll tell you no. You know what I mean? I think a lot of writers who write for blogs are accustomed to very immediate correspondence, and maybe they don't realize that, hey, if I'm pitching something to Rue Morgue now, it's not going to run until months and months from now because print deadlines are so crazy. But I don't expect people to know that. It's a different age, and insofar as I expect people to be patient with me, I'm patient with them.
Yeah, I mean, I've had nothing but kind of pleasant interaction with you, so I mean, I'm content. But that kind of gets into, I guess, for those that are interested in listening, what kind of recommendations would you tell them for pitching?
Oh boy. Well, geez, there are a lot. For one thing, if you are interested in genre writing, and I'm not saying this to crush anyone's dreams or be mean, nobody really writes for Rue Morgue full time. And I say that as somebody who was employed full-time for Rue Morgue. I wish I got to spend more of my day writing. Most of my day is air traffic control and social media and chasing deadlines and chasing images and proofing and kind of stuff like that. So I think people need to have realistic expectations of what is out there in the industry for a paid gig. And if you're hanging your hat on the idea of, retiring and just writing about horror movies all day, you're in for a bit of a surprise. And furthermore, I think people sometimes hear the faculty of horror and think, they only talk about the movies they want to talk about. But if you want to be a freelance writer, you're going to be assigned movies that don't interest you. You're going to have to talk to actors that don't interest you, that maybe you don't especially like, who are boring. It's transcription. It's not as glamorous as it seems, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But further to that, when it comes to pitching the magazine, you certainly want to have a strong voice and you want to have a strong personality. And the fact of the matter is you are pitching me on a written piece, and so your pitch, you can pretty much demonstrate to me whether or not you can write in your pitch. I saw a Twitter thread recently that was like, let's all admit that cover letters don't matter at all in giving you a job. And for me, I really feel like the opposite is true. Like, I don't care if you send me a resume that says that you wrote for this outlet and this outlet and that outlet. Like, you can send me samples for those outlets, but the fact of the matter is those were all edited. Somebody edited those before they posted, so that's not actually an accurate representation of your writing. The best representation I have of your writing is your pitch, is your outreach, is the way you're able to talk to me and make me feel like, hey, what you have to say is important and is relevant and people would want to read it. So I know that's not a very concrete tip, but yeah, your pitch, you have to sell me on the idea. If you tease me with an idea and then expect me to be like, oh, tell me more, odds are I won't, because I don't have time for that. Yeah. You know what I mean? If I have to ask you to tell me more, then you've already missed the boat. You've got my attention. Give me the elevator pitch. Sell me on it. Tell me why. Tell me why now. And yeah, take it from there. And the one thing maybe I'll add to that is that it's not very often that somebody pitches a story and that pitch is accepted exactly the way it's pitched, and it just goes like that. A lot of the time, our features are the result of a collaboration between me and the writer, where, you know, a good idea or a good opportunity has to be kind of molded and massaged to fit the tone of the magazine and to fit in with other features that I'm planning and stuff like that. So I guess that's my other tip, is just to not be too precious about your idea and be willing to work with me on where it could go and how best it would fit into the magazine.
Yeah, I think that is something that I'd agree kind of gets lost a lot of times, is this concept of the collaborative effort that I think goes through something like that. And I think there is this, okay, I'll just write it like this and then it'll be posted and then that'll be it. But there is so much more. And I think those are great tips.
Yeah, and I think that's the result of blog culture. I think for blogs, often people can just treat it as their diaries, right? They can be like, well, you know, I was 8 years old when I first saw this, and I grew up with it, and blah, blah, blah. And that is fine for a blog post, but that's not the kind of writing that we do in the magazine. And, you know, I think that back in the day, when there was a lot of horror magazines and everybody was reading and collecting horror magazines, people knew that. But nowadays, you know, I think people see Rue Morgue and they're like, oh, I can write the same way and get paid for it. It doesn't really work that way. It's a different kind of writing. It's a different kind of skill. It's something anyone can do. And I strongly recommend, I think blogging is really great practice on developing your tone and your voice, but we don't run the same kind of stuff as we would online. And that's important to note.
I'm curious if it is part of the, I mean, I'm assuming it is, but, you know, you have the, I don't want to say toxic, but you have the fan culture, which is like, you know, these obsessive fans that know about it. So they, about something like, I don't know, Friday the 13th. And so, you know, they say, well, I'm going to write about it. And, you know, in the same way that, you know, you have people making, the petitions to change a Star Wars movie or whatever it was because they didn't like it. So there is kind of this, with social media, there's created this, I know people complain about horror Twitter or film Twitter is what they call it.
There does seem to be an air of fan entitlement at the moment, and I think that is also part of the story with regard to blogs. Blogs have given everyone a platform, so everyone feels like they can have a voice, and there's positives and there's negatives to that.
I agree. So I guess kind of talking about, since as I mentioned before, this podcast we'll focus on the independent and the obscure most of the time. And so a different topic, love to hear about like any works that you really champion that you think deserve more eyes. And it can be film, it can be a book, it could be whatever.
I think a film that has been on my mind recently, we actually just ran a feature, it's not on shelves yet, but the September-October edition of the magazine, we ran a big feature on films that you haven't seen of the last 20 years. Because now, being 2020, we could actually run a feature that covers, you know, films of the new millennia. And I had such a tricky time with my writers because they'd be like, you know, I think this film is overrated. And I'd say, no, the assignment isn't overrated. It's overlooked. Yeah. You know, like the films that you didn't hear about, good or bad. And so I think that's a really interesting distinction, especially when it comes to independent stuff. One film that I consider sorely, sorely overlooked, and not only does it appear in that list, but it's going to be the subject of the next Faculty of Horror episode when we return from sabbatical in September, is Pyewacket. And that one is distributed through IFC Midnight, and the writer-director, Adam McDonald, is Torontonian, so he's like my neighbor. He's like my homeboy, and his horror movie is fantastic, and yet I didn't hear anything about it for the longest time. And then I finally checked it out, and I loved it, and I lobbied to have it screened here in Toronto, and Adam was just like, this is the first time I'm getting to see it on the big screen in my home city, and I'm like, that is fucked.
Yeah.
So I highly encourage anyone hearing this to check that one out. It's magical. It's marvelous. Let's see, what else? The festival circuit is ramping up, so I'll be checking out a whole lot of movies through Fantasia and TIFF coming up. I caught The Reckoning, which isn't really independent, nor would I necessarily recommend it. I'm trying to think of books, too. I've definitely read some great ones this year. I can recommend Max Brooks has a new book out. He wrote World War Z, and his new book concerns Bigfoot, the Sasquatch. Its title is escaping me right now. God.
Isn't it de-evolution or
That's it.
Yes.
Devolution. Thank you. I was hoping you might know. Yeah, definitely recommend that. Daniel Kraus has a book out that he finished. It's George Romero's unfinished novel that he finished. I actually just interviewed him a couple of days ago, so that one's hot in my brain too. That one also has an amazing audiobook. If you're interested in audiobooks, I think it's available on Audible. And the narrators they got are really great.
Oh, yeah. No, that's a whole nother topic, I guess, for me, because I'm a big fan of audio drama, too. I listen to Tales from Beyond the Pale and
Yeah, I'm told that's kind of becoming the next big thing. And I guess the difference between an audiobook and an audio drama is that it's more actors, it's less narrated, and more like a roundtable read-along.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, especially with that one, and I've had the pleasure of writing on it a couple times and interviewing Glenn McQuaid about it, where, some of them, it's almost more effective than any movie I've seen in the past, 10 years or 20 years or something, where some of them just really hit you. I think because of that element of, it's scarier in your own mind than actually seeing something on the screen.
Right.
But no, it's been there was actually something kind of, as we're wrapping up a little bit, that you were talking about that I'd love to go back on, especially when we're at the beginning of the movies that you haven't seen in the past 20 years, of like retouching on this. I noticed there is this thing with some people when they talk, and it might be fan entitlement or the blog culture, but there's this mentality with film criticism or book criticism where if somebody doesn't like something on a personal level, then it's instantly a bad movie. And I thought that was something great that you always put in Faculty of Horror, that it's your personal preference if you don't like it or not. But there is kind of that more and more I've seen, where I've heard people talk about, Midsummer is like a student film, and you cannot like it, but you can't deny that it's not well crafted.
Yeah, well, it's a tricky thing. I mean, definitely there's a line between professional appreciation of a film. There are people who are, educated and certified to be film critics, and these people aren't necessarily giving their opinions. They're giving an educated assessment, which is still a subjective thing. But it should be noted that some people are professional film critics, and other people are just people on Twitter. But that said, I think when it comes to the horror community, horror is you either love horror or you don't care about it. There's not really much in between. And so when I meet someone who's a fellow horror fan, I tend to make a lot of assumptions that we have a lot in common. I tend to assume, for example, that they are not, racist or misogynist, or I tend to assume that they are aligned with what I consider a very progressive film genre. And I assume that we have so much in common. And so if there's a movie out there that I really love that they don't really love, you kind of feel like, but wait, I thought we were the same. Yeah. You know what I mean? I thought we were on the same team here. So I think within horror appreciation, tastes are a little bit more loaded than maybe they are when it comes to, a comedy film or a drama film. It's like, oh, well, you didn't like Schindler's List? Like, I don't really give a fuck. But when it comes to horror movies, I do give a fuck because I take them so seriously and they reach me so deep in my heart that I'm always fascinated to find out where that subjectivity lies with someone else who didn't like something that I really loved. And I think the podcast has been a brilliant exercise in that because Alex and I are very close friends, and I want her to love the things that I love so that we can love them together, and we can get equally excited about a sequel to that, for example, or a re-release or a reissue. But we have a lot in common, and it's good to not have some things in common.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And we found even in this podcast itself that there's been plenty of points where there's movies that I guess I'm deemed out of the three of us the nicer one, that I'll give more passes to things for some reason, but there's definitely is that difference that sometimes it gets to not to be heated, but that it's a very strong opinion about somebody liking one and then somebody liking another. I know because I know you both enjoy this, that there's one member of our group who absolutely did not like Suspiria, the remake, and so there was kind of this back and forth that's been happening with that, and other movies of that nature.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
I've been there.
Yeah. But no, I know that we're kind of wrapping up, and I'd just love to let you to help promote anything I can. So is there any sort of, how can people find you? How can people look you out? Are there any projects that you're working on for the future that you'd love to discuss?
Well, there's a couple of things percolating that I can't discuss, which is really exciting because there were many, many months where nothing was happening because we were all in lockdown, so I didn't have the luxury of having secrets. But I will definitely be talking about those things soon. So the best way to find out about them is to follow me on social media. I'm on everything. I feel like it's harder to avoid me on social media than it is to find me, but I'm definitely on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. Check out Rue Morgue if you're interested. We're one of the last ones standing. We're proudly independent, and I think the quality of our design is second to none. Our art designer is incredible, and I think people who didn't grow up with horror magazines, which is more and more the case in 2020, don't really know quite what it's like to be holding it in your hand and physically turning the pages and how that feels. So I really invite you to check it out if you haven't. And then, of course, Faculty of Horror, we're going on year 8. We're going to have our annual t-shirt drive pretty soon, so look for that. And if you enjoy that content, we've got a Patreon now with a lot of different tiers for a lot of different kinds of bonus content. I think that's it.
Okay. No, that's great. And I'm going to be looking out for your big news. So thank you so much for joining me.
Big news.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for having me, Craig. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Bloodhound Pix podcast is part of the Morbidly Beautiful podcast network. Produced by Josh Lee, Craig Drum, and Kyle Hintz. Music by Raymond Seed. Editing by Kyle Hintz.